Tony Bender, Anthony Strollo to those outside the life, was a man who knew the value of connections. He wasn't just a highly placed figure in the Genovese crime family. He was a broker of power, a man who played both sides not just against each other, but with each other. He had the kind of understanding that made him indispensable, the kind that allowed him to do business where others couldn't, to set up meetings that others wouldn't dare to arrange. And in those early days of organized crime, that skill was invaluable. One of the most significant meetings he ever put together was between Salvatore Maranzano and Charlie "Lucky" Luciano. It wasn't just business. It was the future of the underworld being shaped in real time. At that moment, Luciano was still aligned with Joe Masseria, but the tides were shifting. He knew it. Everyone knew it. The last time he had tried to move independently, it ended with him being snatched off the street, beaten so badly he barely survived. But Maranzano had to let him go. Not out of mercy, but out of necessity. Because Luciano was the only man in New York who could get close enough to Joe the boss to take him out. Now, the dust had settled, and Luciano knew Masseria's days were numbered. The time had come to make the final move. He gathered his closest men at a secluded spot in Oyster Bay. This time, Meyer Lansky was there. The plan was put in motion, and word was sent to Maranzano. Luciano was ready. For the good of everybody, he'd do what Maranzano had wanted him to do a year earlier on Staten Island: get rid of Masseria. The meeting was arranged through Tony Bender. Maranzano, ever the cautious old-school boss, had one condition. He wasn't letting Luciano pick the spot this time. After what happened on the pier, Lucky would later say, I wasn't about to give him the right time of day when it came to picking the place. So they met in the Bronx Zoo. It was late in the afternoon, the sky bruised with the last light of the day. The air was thick with the scent of hay and the distant wild musk of caged animals. Lucky arrived with Tommy Lucchese, Joe Adonis, and Bugsy Siegel at his side. The presence of Siegel, a Jewish mobster, was deliberate. Luciano wanted to see how Maranzano would react. Would he pull that Sicilian exclusivity routine? Would he flinch? Maranzano, on his end, had Joe Profaci and Joe Bonanno with him. They met in front of the lion cage. Luciano, ever the showman, smirked. I hope you appreciate that the lion is supposed to be the king of the animals. A fitting backdrop. Because after this meeting there would be a new king in New York. That deal with Maranzano? It didn't last long, but then again, neither did Luciano's reign as the undisputed boss of New York. He was a powerful man, small in stature, but larger than life. A force of nature. And that made him a threat. Not just to rival bosses across America, but to the so-called leaders of America. The men in tailored suits who called themselves the founding families of the country. They knew what Luciano had done, knew he had rewritten the rules of the underworld. That kind of talent wasn't easy to contain, but it could be redirected. First, they had to break his spirit. Then, they had to destroy his reputation. Enter Tom Dewey. Dewey, a crusading prosecutor with political ambitions, needed a big win. He turned Luciano into public enemy number one, painting him as the king of vice and corruption, the mastermind behind a vast prostitution ring. The trial was a spectacle. The conviction was inevitable. 10 years in prison. A decade behind bars was enough to make anyone bend, even lucky Luciano. But luck had a way of circling back to those who knew how to use it. By the early 1940s, the world was at war, and America needed all the help it could get, even from the men they had locked away. Naval intelligence and the newly formed Office of Strategic Services were desperate to secure the docks. to keep German saboteurs from turning New York's waterfront into a graveyard. They needed an inside man, someone who could ensure the cooperation of the longshoremen, the unions, and the gangsters who really controlled the docks. And they needed a man with connections in Sicily. They reached out through Albert Anastasia. A deal was made. In exchange for his eventual freedom, Luciano would do what he did best: run things. He helped secure the docks, making sure there were no unexplained fires, no cargo ships mysteriously sinking, no Nazi infiltrators slipping through the cracks. And in 1943, when the Allies needed a foothold in Italy, Luciano's contacts in Sicily opened the doors for the invasion. It was enough. In 1946, he was deported from the country he had once ruled. But Luciano wasn't the only thing being sent away. The entire structure of organized crime was about to shift. First, the Mangano brothers were eliminated, paving the way for Albert Anastasia's rise to power. Then Joe Adonis was deported, Frank Costello started eyeing retirement, and Vito Genovese, always the patient schemer, began maneuvering his people into position. One of them was Anthony Strollo. The same Tony Bender who had once arranged meetings between bosses was now the man everyone wanted to meet. He had risen from an influential messenger to an underboss, a man who stood at the right hand of Vito Genovese. It was a climb that many envied. But it was too fast, too sudden. And then, in 1962, he vanished. Right when Robert Kennedy was tearing through the old guard of organized crime, exposing their empires and dragging their names into the spotlight, Tony Bender disappeared without a trace. The whispers were immediate. A power play, a double cross, a betrayal. The article you're about to hear originally appeared in my Fat Tony Salerno Press Bonanza, but I've pulled out the excerpt detailing Anthony Strollo's murder and the theories surrounding it. What you're about to hear is a fascinating piece of history, one that gives you insight into a man who shaped the Luciano family and the underworld itself. On January 10, 1970, the Daily News unveiled chilling details from FBI transcripts linking Angelo DeCarlo and Ruggiero, Richie the Boot Boiardo, to the disappearance and presumed murder of Anthony Tony Bender Strollo in 1962. The conversations suggest Strollo was executed on orders from Vito Genovese, who was displeased with Strollo's handling of the Gallo conflict and his narcotics involvement. The transcripts paint a grim picture of mob executions, particularly at Boiardo's Livingston estate, rumored to be a site of gruesome disposal methods. Here is the article in full. Frank Faso and Henry Strollo, dapper underworld nightclub figures who disappeared almost 8 years ago, were linked to conversations indicating either Richie the Boot Boiardo or Little Pussy Russo could have been involved in their murders. FBI-taped conversations, revealed yesterday, suggest that Anthony Tony Bender Strollo, the Greenwich Village boss, was possibly killed either by Ruggiero, Little Pussy Russo, or by Richie the Boot. The question was raised, who killed Tony? Russo was questioned about it. Russo lit a cigarette, the flicker of the flame casting fleeting shadows across his face. He took a slow drag, exhaling smoke like he was letting go of a weight that had been pressing on his chest. I thought of that too, he said, his voice low and deliberate, like he was revealing a secret he'd kept buried. DeCarlo leaned forward, his eyes sharp and searching, the tension in the room tightening like a noose. When you got Tony? He asked, his words slicing through the haze of smoke. Russo nodded, his expression unreadable, but his tone carrying a hint of something darker. Yeah, he said simply, the weight of that single word hanging in the air like a loaded gun. Thus, from the conversation, it appears either Richie the Boot or Little Pussy could have been Bender's actual killer. Federal court in Newark has released 1,200 pages of transcripts of conversations held by Angelo DeCarlo. One conversation, dated April 22, 1963, contained an interesting exchange between Russo and DeCarlo. Russo recalled an occasion when the boot talked to Samuel, Momo Giancana, alias Sam Mooney, the Chicago Hood. The transcript noted that the next few remarks were fragmentary, but it appeared that Giancana was teasing Boiardo about keeping Russo with him, an old-timer, and that he was neither learning nor doing anything important. He, Giancana, offered to take Russo to Chicago. Later, between Russo and DeCarlo, there was this exchange concerning the Giancana situation. Russo leaned back, his voice taking on a sharp edge as he mimicked Giancana's taunting tone. "What is he learning? Has he killed any?" The words hung in the air, heavy with implication. DeCarlo's jaw tightened as he recalled the exchange. He, referring to Boiardo, said, "Yeah?" "He killed Tony Bender." DeCarlo paused, the memory clearly weighing on him. "I told him, Mooney, please, don't get me involved." But Giancana didn't let up. His voice rang out in DeCarlo's head like a taunt that couldn't be shaken. "Are you yellow?" he had shot back, testing DeCarlo's resolve. DeCarlo shook his head as he relayed the moment, his voice lowering with frustration. "Don't he know it was Vito's orders?" he muttered, as if even now, years later, Giancana's question still cut deeper than it should have. Strollo, 62, liked silk suits and long black Cadillacs. He left his Fort Lee, New Jersey mansion in a Cadillac on April 8, 1962, telling his wife he was just going out for a newspaper. Strollo, chief lieutenant of the then-imprisoned Vito Genovese, never returned, and authorities have never been able to find his body or the 1961 black Cadillac with New Jersey plates in which he vanished. While the transcript does not explain what happened to Strollo's body, authorities believe he was lured to Richie the Boot's estate in Livingston, New Jersey, and that there the body was disposed of. The house in Livingston. In another conversation, Russo and DeCarlo presumably discussed Boiardo's Livingston home. DeCarlo leaned in close, his voice steady but laced with unease. "I know a lot of guys got hit there. I know," he said, his tone heavy with the weight of grim knowledge. Russo nodded, his voice dropping to a whisper, as if the walls themselves might betray him. "I must have hit some myself, guys walking up there like that," he murmured, his eyes darting as he spoke. "They'd let them in. That door, the garage door. Behind the door. They'd throw them back down there." DeCarlo stiffened. "Where?" he asked, though he wasn't sure he wanted the answer. Russo gestured vaguely, his whisper barely audible. "Up in the greenhouse. All the way back. All the way up. They got a big hole there." He paused, the words coming out slower, darker. "They put 'em in there and burned them." DeCarlo exhaled sharply, shaking his head in disbelief. "He's a real nut, a sadist," he said, his voice rising just enough to betray his disgust. Russo didn't argue. A nut, he repeated, his tone almost frantic. "Just to impress people." DeCarlo scoffed, the incredulity clear in his voice. "Oh, he just did it to show everybody what a great guy he is, that he's got guts. He'd take anyone's headaches. They'd give him the bodies. It's just a miracle." The room seemed to grow colder with every word, the weight of the unspoken atrocities pressing down on them both. According to authoritative sources, Strollo was foreman of a temporary triumvirate ruling the Genovese family while Vito was in Atlanta. Vito Genovese was still calling shots from his cell, however, and he reportedly commissioned Strollo to straighten out the Gallo mob. The Gallos were then shooting up Brooklyn, causing great aggravation to the authorized Profaci family of Cosa Nostra, and making raids into Manhattan territory. Instead of calming down the Gallos, Strollo was said to have stirred them up more, and his partners in the triumvirate Gerardo Catena, and Tommy Ryan Eboli suspected he was using the gallows to ease them out. Catena and Eboli complained to Genovese, as did the Profaci mob. There was a third complaint against Strollo, that he had ignored Genovese's commands to get out of narcotics traffic and stay out. The word, he dies. From Genovese, the word came back that Strollo was to be killed, and the contract was given to the mob in New Jersey. According to informants, Strollo was lured to Richie, the Boots estate in Livingston, because someone in the Genovese family was having a problem. One of Strollo's own men drove him to Newark, where another car met him and took him to Livingston.